Hello all, welcome back to FAD Learning. In our previous sessions, we have covered structural fundamental building blocks of Angular, including components, data binding, directives, routings, and pipes. Now, in the next few videos, we will be diving into one of the most important building block of Angular called Angular Forms. So you might wonder, why do we need forms in Angular? After all, we have already created a login page without using forms. But as our applications grow and become more complex, Angular forms provide a robust solution for managing user input, validating data, and handling multiple form fields. That is the reason the Angular team introduced forms. So, what are Angular forms? Angular Forms is a module in the Angular framework that provides a way to handle user input and validate form data. And they offer a robust and scalable way to manage forms in Angular applications. And in which scenario do we need to use Angular Forms? First, complex form validations. Angular forms are idle when we have a complex form validations. As they provide a built-in validation system, this makes it easy to validate user input and display error messages. Second, large-scale applications. Angular forms are suitable for large-scale applications as they are designed to handle complex data-driven form. Third, Angular forms are useful for dynamic form generation, allowing us to create forms based on user input or server-side data. And last, two-way data binding. Angular forms provide two-way data binding, which means that changes to the form data are automatically reflected in the component's properties. So by using Angular forms, we can enable users to perform various data entry tasks and streamline our development process to build more robust and user-friendly applications. And Angular provides two types to building forms. First is template-driven forms. These forms are created using HTML template and suitable for simple forms. So the template-driven approach is great for simple forms. It's easy to use and we can create nice-looking forms without writing any extra code. Second type of form is reactive forms. These forms are created programmatically using the form control and from group classes and are suitable for complex forms. And reactive forms are also called as model driven forms or model driven approach. In this reactive forms, the form logic is defined in the component as an object, and this form offers several benefits, including easier testing of the component. Now, let's understand what are the steps we need to follow while creating the template driven form. And the first step is import forms module. We need to import the forms module in our component, and this module provides the necessary directives for working with template driven forms. Second, we need to build our form using standard HTML form elements such as input field, checkboxes, buttons, etc. And third step is we need to convert our HTML form to a template driven form by adding the ngForm directive to the form element. And this directive creates a form group instance from the form. Fourth step is to use form control. Although not explicitly required, form control is a building block of Angular forms. It represents a single form field and can be used to track the field's value, validation status, and user interactions using the ngModel directive. And the last step is to submit the form. We can use the ngSubmit directive to handle form submission. And this directive calls the specified method when the form is submitted, allowing us to process the form data. So by following these 5 steps, we can create a fully functional template-driven form in Angular. Now, let's start by exploring an example of template-driven form, and then we will move on to reactive forms. So I'll jump into the Visual Studio Code Editor and we will continue from there. So here I have created a new component called template driven form using the CLI command. Then I have added a root for it in app.routes.ts file with the path TDF, means template driven form. And also I have added the new nav link labeled TDF to the navbar. Now inside the browser we can see the TDF link on the navbar. And on click of this link, we can see the template driven form component rendered on the web. Now, as per the first step to work with template driven forms, first we need to import the forms module in the imports array to enable the template driven form functionality. And if you are working on a module based Angular application, then the forms module is imported in the ng module of the app.module.ts file. Alternatively, if you are working on a standalone component, you need to import the forms module inside the imports array of the respective component class file. So since we are working on an Angular 19 application which uses standalone components, so I will import the forms module inside the imports array of the template driven form component. So this is our first step. Now next step is to create an HTML template for the form using standard HTML form elements. So here I would like to use a Bootstrap form field. So I will open Bootstrap site for Bootstrap form. In here, let me copy this first div and paste this div inside our HTML file. Before that, I'll take one container class and inside this div, I'll paste a Bootstrap form field. And now I'll remove an unnecessary code. Like I don't need this for, I don't need this ID, and I don't need this small element. I'll edit this field with first name. And for first name, type must be text. And since we are building a form, I'll move this div inside form tag. We need to change the placeholder, enter first name. Now I'll duplicate this div 3 to 4 times and quickly update the field's name accordingly. The second div for last name and third div for email. For email, type should be email and placeholder should be enter email address. And here I'll update password. And for this password, type should be password and placeholder should be enter password. I would like to add one checkbox in the same form. So here I'll change the class with form check and label should be check me out. And for checkbox, type must be checkbox. And I don't need placeholder for this field. And for this input, the class should be form check input. Control X, Control B. And at last, I'll add one submit button with class btn.btn success. The button name is submit. Now save the changes and have a look on the browser. Okay, let me add margin for all this field. Margin 2. Okay. Now save the changes and here you can see we have created a simple form. Let me add one h2 tag with text user information. And I'll add the class sendTop. So with this, we have completed the second step. Now, as per the third step, Angular automatically converts our form with form elements into a template driven form using the ngForm directive. And to access the ngForm properties and methods, we can export the ngForm instance to a local template reference variable using the syntax hash and local template variable name, let's say user form equals to ngForm. And this ngForm directive creates a form group, which is a collection of form controls. And by using the template variable user form, we can access various properties and methods of ngForm. So this was our third step. Now the fourth step is to bind the form controls. And one form control corresponds to one form field. So in our HTML template, we have 5 form fields like first name, last name, email, password, and checkbox with label check me out. And to connect these fields to our component, we need to add ng model directive to each one. And also the ng model directives uses the name attribute to establish this connection. Like here, if I use ng model directive without the name attribute, you will see an error message. Here, if I save the changes, you can see if ng model is used within the form tag, either the name attribute must be set or the form control must be defined as a standalone in ng model option. So this indicates that it's mandatory to include the name attribute when using ng model. So here, let me add a name attribute with value first name. Now you can see error has gone. Now I'll declare a variable with name first name. So here, first name of type string equals to empty string. And now I'll bind its value to the ng model directive using the banana in a box syntax. Ng model equals to first name. And now I'll print this first name variable below this heading using string interpolation syntax. And in the browser, as I start typing first name, FED learning, you will see the same text updated here with the first name variable. Similarly, we can do the same with the second field, last name. So here I'll declare a new variable named last name and bind it with ng model. Here I'll paste the same name attribute and ng model. And here let me update last name. And now below this first field, I'll print the last name. Save the changes and let me type something. Okay, here the last name should be like this. Now, if I type something in the last name field, and as expected, this also works like first name. But imagine in the future, if we have 20 fields, then we would have to declare 20 variables inside .ts file. So to avoid overloading our component class file with all 20 variables, we can create a separate file to store these variables. And that file is called as model. And it is good practice to keep component class files organized and focused on component logic. So for large numbers of form fields, consider creating a separate model file to store variables, which can also be reused across multiple components if needed. And in Angular, models can be created using two approaches, class and interface. And we should create a class when we need to add methods or logic to our model. In contrast, we should use an interface when we only need to define a shape or structure of our data. And both classes and interfaces can be used to represent data models in Angular. And we can create class using the command ngGenerate class name and create an interface using command ngGenerate interface name. So let me create a model by running the command ngGenerate interface name, I for interface, and followed by interface name, user. Enter. And this will generate a new file called user.interface.ts in the current directory containing the basic structure of an interface like this. Export interface name user. And if you want to learn more about TypeScript interfaces, kindly check out my interface video from the TypeScript tutorial. Now, inside this user interface, we can declare the properties required for our form. So let's add the 5 properties corresponding to these 5 form fields, like first name of type string And additionally, we can define extra properties as optional by using the question mark. By doing so, we allow the forms to have some or all of those optional properties, making the interface more flexible. Okay, so this is how I have added 5 properties for the 5 fields of user information form. So here we are exporting the user interface, which means it allows us to import and reuse it whenever we need this model in our application. Now, inside .ts file, instead of these 2 properties, let's declare a new object called user object and assign it the type user. And let's initialize it as an empty object to store the user information. And make sure we have to import the path of this user interface. Now we have all the properties of user interface in user object. So let's bind each property to user object in the template file using the ngModel directive. So here, instead of first name, now I'll bind this first name with user object dot first name because we have declared this property inside user interface. So similarly, I'll update the last name user object dot last name, and I'll copy this name attribute and ng model, and I'll paste this for all 3 form fields. This is for email. The value of ng model will be user object dot email. This name should be pass, and the ng model value user object dot pass. And this is check user object dot check. Okay, so this is how I have binded all the properties of user interface using user object. But here, if you try to assign a value to a property that's not defined in the user interface, then TypeScript will raise an error. For example, here I am trying to access the name property instead of first name. So this will result an error saying property name does not exist on type user. It means this name property does not exist on type user means inside user interface. Okay, so let me update this with first name. Okay, so with this we have completed our 4th step. Now our template is ready except for the final piece. That is our 5th step, submitting data to the component. And for this, we need to use the ng-submit event to submit the form data to the component class. Let's use the event binding to bind the ng-submit event to the onSubmit method in the component class. So inside parentheses, we need to write ng-submit equals to onSubmit. And we need to pass the local template variable user form to the onSubmit method. And this variable references the ngForm directive, allowing us to access and extract data from the form fields within our component class. Now, when the user click on the submit button, the ng-submit event will be triggered. So the final step is to receive the form data in our component. And to do this, we will create an onSubmit method within our component class file. And this method receives the ngForm directive reference, which we have named userForm of type ngForm. And to verify the submitted data, we can log the form's value to the console using console.log. So here I'll write userForm.value. Now save the changes and open the browser and fill out the form. First name, I'll write FED, last name, learning, email, fedlearning24@gmail.com. And password 1234. And then I'll click on this checkbox. And now first let me open the developer console to see the output. And now I'll click on the submit button, and here we can see the field values inside console: email, first name, check, last name, and password. So with this, we have successfully created a template driven form using all the 5 steps. And also we have received the form data in our component. So let's review all 5 steps quickly. In Angular template driven forms, first we have imported forms module into the imports array of the template driven form component. Second, we have created an HTML form. And third, Angular has detected the form tag and we have converted that form into the Angular forms using the ngForm directive. Fourth, we have added the ngModel directive with name attribute to each form element. And finally, we have bound the submit event via event binding. Okay. Now we have gained access to the ngForm instance through the local template variable user form, and we can leverage its various properties and methods to determine the current state of the form. For example, here I'll use pre-tag. Inside that, I'll write some properties or methods like value, and inside double curly brackets, I'll bind the value of user form. User form dot value, and here I'll use JSON pipe. In order to use JSON pipe, first we need to import it inside imports array JSON pipe. Similarly, I'll add few more properties here like valid, username dot valid. This is for invalid. And third is for touched. Fifth is for untouched. This is for submitted. So here I have added 6 properties that determine the current state of the form. Let's understand all these properties with output. Property first name does not exist. Okay. Let me delete these 2 lines and now save the changes. And here you can see the output of value property is empty object because we need to fill the values inside the form. So here let me fill fed. You can see inside value we can see the first name property. Similarly, if I type last name, that is learning, the last name property is added inside this value object. Same for email, password, and checkbox. Okay, now you can see the value object with all 5 properties of user information form. Now let me refresh the page and let's understand the second property, that is valid. And this valid returns true if the form is valid, otherwise returns false. And in our current scenario, none of the form fields are marked as required. So as a result, the form is considered valid even when no fields are filled in. This means we can submit the form without entering any value. And if I mark any field as required, like here, if I add this first name field as required and save the changes, now you can see the valid property returns false. And once I fill the first name, then it becomes true because we have filled all mandatory fields. Now the form is valid and we can submit the form. Now let's understand the third property, that is invalid. And this property returns true if the form is invalid, otherwise return false. In this case, our form is invalid because this first name is required field. Once I fill this field, the invalid property becomes false. Here you can see. So hope you understand the difference between valid and invalid property. Next property is touched. This property returns true if the user has interacted or touched with at least one form field. So right now this is returning false, but once I touch to any field, it becomes true. Here you can see. Similarly, untouched returns true if the user has not interacted or untouched with any form fields. And if I touched or interact with any form field, it becomes false, like this. Now last property is submitted. It returns true if the form has been submitted, otherwise return false. If I fill the required field and click on submit button, it becomes true. Here you can see. Okay, so this is how we have understood various properties and methods to determine the current state of the form. Now, let me comment out these property and let's understand how to set the values in template driven forms. Under this, we will learn how to set default or initial values to form controls. Also, we will understand how to set values dynamically, and after that, we will see how to reset form values. Okay, so there are two ways we can set the value of the form elements. First is two-way data binding, and second is using template reference variable. And we have already explored setting values using two-way data binding with the ng model directive. Now let's move on to the second approach, that is setting values using the template reference variable. So let's start using the initial or default value. And as we all know, once our component is initialized, the ng on init lifecycle hook will get called. So we can set the default value to the user object as per the user model in the ng on init method. So let me implement ng on init first, and then we need to define the ng on init method inside class. Now inside this ng on init method, I'll print the user object with initial value. So here inside this object, I'll pass the initial value to all these properties. First name Rahul, last name Verma, email rahul@gmail.com, password 12345, and it true. Now save the changes and let's have a look at the browser. And as you can see here, the form has rendered on the browser with default values. Okay, so this is how we can set initial or default value inside ng on init lifecycle hook. But we have a user form reference variable, which is an instance of a ng form. So once we have the reference, we can use the setValue method of the ng form to set the initial value. And to do this, I'll first create a new button in the HTML file with name setValue. Warning. And here I'll add a click event and I'll assign a function called setValues and pass the user form reference variable. And now I'll define the same function inside the ts file. Here also I'll pass user form of type ng form. And inside this setValues method, we will declare a new object using let keyword, let obj equals to, I'll assign the same values inside this obj object. And for now, let's comment out this user object in the ng on init method. And next, we will pass this new obj object to the setValue method. Like here, user form dot setValue, and inside round bracket, I'll pass the obj object. Now save the changes and let's refresh the browser. Okay, user form does not exist. User form. Okay, here let me correct the spelling. User form, and here we should be capital. Set values, and now save the changes and let's refresh the page. And here you can see the form is empty because we have commented out the code in the ng on init method. And to set the form values dynamically, we need to click the set values button, and now we can see the form with values. Let me refresh the page again, and again I'll click on set values button, and as expected we can see the form values. Okay, so this is how we have successfully set the values individually using the set value methods of each form control. But what if we want to set only these 3 properties instead of all 5 properties. Like here, if I comment out these 2 properties from this object, and now let me open developer tool again, clear the console. And once I click on this set value button, it will throw an error saying must supply a value of form field with name pass. And if I uncomment this pass, we can see the same message for each check property like this. Okay, which means that with the set value method, we must set all properties even if we don't need them. And to set only the required properties, we can use the patch value method. So let's try this out quickly. For patch value, I'll create another button named patch value with corresponding method called patch value. And I'll change the button color to primary. Next, I'll define this patch value method inside PS file. Below this, I'll pass same user form of type ngForm. And inside this patch value method, I'll copy paste this same object, but this time I'll not set the last 2 properties. Here I'll uncomment this eCheck property, and inside this patch value property, now we have set only 3 properties: first name, last name, and email property. Now here, after this object, I'll use the control property of ngForm, which returns a reference to the top level form group. And then I'll utilize the patch value method to update only the first name, last name, and value field. Inside this patch value, I'll write obj. Now let's check the result in the browser. If I click on set values button, it sets all form fields value. Now I'll refresh the page, and this time I'll click on patch values button. And as you can see, it sets only the required fields value, that is first name, last name, and email. And the password field is empty and checkbox is unchecked because we have set only 3 properties inside this patch value method. So this method demonstrates how to use the patch value method to update only a few fields at any time. So what is the key difference between the set value and patch value methods? The set value method sets a new value of an individual control, and it's strictly following the form group structure and replacing the entire control value. In contrast, the patch value method replaces only the properties defined in the object that have changed in the form model, allowing for more targeted updates. Now last, let's understand how to reset the form to its initial empty state using the reset or resetForm method of the ngForm. So let's create a new button for reset with corresponding function name resetValue. And I'll change the button class to secondary. Now next, let's define the resetValues function inside the class file with user form of type ngForm. Now inside this resetValues function, we can use either the reset method or we can use resetForm method to reset the form. Let me comment out one method and let's test in the browser. First, let's populate the form field values by clicking either the set values or patch values button, and then we can reset the form. So let me click on set values, and then to reset the form, we can simply click the reset button. Here we can see our form is empty. Now let's comment out this reset method and uncomment this reset form method. And this time I'll populate the form fields value using patch value button, and then in order to reset the form, I'll click on reset button. Okay, so it means with the help of these 2 methods, we can reset the entire form. And these 2 methods not only clear the form's value, but also reset the form status, including its dirty, valid, touched states. Okay, so far we have explored how to create template driven form. Then we have seen how to set the default values using setValue and patchValue methods. And last, we have seen how to reset the entire form. Now, in the next video, we will dive into adding validations to the same form. So, thank you for watching and don't forget to subscribe to FAD Learning for quick and easy learning. Thank you. Bye bye.